Are you the kind of person who gets hurt easily? Not dramatically, not obviously, but quietly, in ways most people never notice. A slightly cold reply from a friend and you spend the rest of the day replaying it. An offhand joke at your expense, and it lodges itself somewhere behind your ribs for a week. Someone forgets to invite you to something small, something that shouldn't matter, and it somehow confirms every fear you have ever had about being unwanted. If any of this sounds familiar, this video is for you, because what I am about to describe is not a personality flaw you were born with. It is a wound left open by design, and there is a very specific reason it has never closed, no matter how many times you have told yourself to stop being so sensitive. Most people assume the goal is to stop feeling things so intensely, to become harder, thicker-skinned, less reactive. But Carl Jung would tell you this goal is not only unrealistic, it is aimed at the wrong target entirely. The problem was never that you feel deeply. The problem is that your sense of self has been left undefended, wide open to whoever walks by with a careless comment or a cold shoulder. Becoming impossible to hurt has nothing to do with feeling less. It has everything to do with where your sense of worth actually lives. And right now, if you are the kind of person who gets hurt easily, it does not live inside you. It lives out there, scattered across the opinions of everyone you have ever wanted approval from. And that is precisely why the smallest gesture from any one of them can knock you off balance so completely. Think about the last time something small wrecked your entire mood. A text left on read for too long. A compliment that never came when you expected it. A friend who seemed distracted while you were talking, and you spent the rest of the conversation wondering what you had done wrong. In the moment, it feels like the other person's behavior caused your pain directly, like a stone thrown at glass. But Jung would ask you to look closer, because the truth is more uncomfortable than that. The pain was not caused by the stone alone. It was caused by the fact that there was no wall there to begin with. Someone with a solid sense of self can absorb a careless comment, the way a stone wall absorbs a pebble, a small sound, nothing more. But if there is no wall, if your entire structure is glass, every pebble becomes a shattering event. This is the first thing to understand, and it changes everything that follows. You are not too sensitive, you are unprotected, and there is a very important difference between the two. Because sensitivity is not something you need to eliminate. Your capacity to feel deeply, to notice tone, to sense when something is wrong before anyone says it out loud, this is not a weakness. It is often the very thing that makes you perceptive, empathetic, alive to the world in a way that colder people never are. What needs to change is not your depth of feeling. What needs to change is the structure around it, the part of you that determines whether a comment lands as information or as an injury. Jung spent much of his work exploring what he called the ego, not in the modern sense of arrogance, but in the psychological sense, the center of your conscious identity, the part of you that experiences itself as I. And one of Jung's most important observations was that a poorly developed ego, one that has never been given a stable foundation, becomes entirely dependent on external validation to know that it exists at all. If no one confirms your worth today, some part of you quietly begins to doubt that the worth was ever real. This is why a single dismissive comment can undo an entire week of feeling good about yourself. Your sense of self was never actually anchored inside you. It was borrowed, moment to moment, from the reactions of everyone around you, and borrowed things can always be taken back. So how does a person actually become impossible to hurt, not numb, not cold, not disconnected, but genuinely resilient in a way that allows them to remain open and feeling while no longer being at the mercy of every small slight that crosses their path? There is a framework hidden inside Jung's work that most people never assemble into something usable, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I call it the 3 layers of psychological armor, and unlike the armor you might be imagining, this is not armor that keeps people out. It is armor that keeps your center intact, no matter who comes close. The 3 layers are withdrawal of projection, internal authorship, and shadow integration. Stay with me, because each one on its own changes very little. Together, they change almost everything. The first layer, withdrawal of projection, begins with a question almost no one asks themselves in the moment they are hurt. When someone's words wound you, whose voice is actually doing the damage? It rarely feels this way, but Jung would argue that most pain caused by other people's comments is not actually caused by them. It is caused by an old, unexamined belief about yourself that their comment happened to brush against. If someone calls you lazy and it barely registers, it is because some settled part of you already knows it isn't true. But if someone calls you lazy and it destroys you for the rest of the day, it is usually because some fragile, unexamined part of you was already terrified that it might be. The other person did not create the wound. They located one that was already there, waiting, unhealed, and mistaken for something permanent about who you are. This is what Jung meant by projection working in both directions. We assume projection is something other people do to us, casting their insecurities onto us unfairly. But we are constantly doing the same thing in reverse, projecting authority onto other people's opinions, treating a stranger's passing comment as though it carries the weight of objective truth about our worth. Withdrawing projection means catching yourself in that exact moment and asking a simple, unglamorous question. Is this actually true, or am I simply handing this person the power to define me because some part of me has never decided for myself? Most of the time, when you actually stop and ask this, the sting weakens almost immediately. Not because the comment becomes kinder, but because you stop mistaking someone else's momentary judgment for a verdict on your entire identity. Picture two people receiving the exact same piece of criticism at work. A manager says offhandedly in front of the team that a report could have been more thorough. The first person spirals immediately, replaying the sentence for the rest of the day, wondering if everyone now secretly thinks they are incompetent, drafting mental defenses they will never actually deliver, losing sleep that night over 5 careless words. The second person hears the same sentence, feels a brief flicker of discomfort, and within an hour has either forgotten it entirely or used it as useful, specific information to improve the next report. The comment was identical. The wound was not. The only real difference between them was where their sense of competence actually lived, inside a stable internal structure, or out in the open, waiting for a manager's tone to determine its value for the day. Before we go further, if this framework is starting to make sense of something you have felt for years but never had language for, take a moment and subscribe, because the second and third layers of this armor are where the real transformation happens, and I don't want you to miss them. The second layer is internal authorship, and this is where most self-help advice stops short, offering vague encouragement to simply love yourself more without ever explaining what that actually requires. Internal authorship means becoming the primary narrator of your own story instead of allowing every person who walks through your life to co-write it without your consent. Right now, if you are easily hurt, you are likely allowing almost everyone temporary authorship over how you see yourself. A friend's mood determines your worth for an afternoon. A stranger's opinion online determines your worth for an evening. A partner's distracted silence determines your worth for an entire week. You have, without realizing it, handed the pen to whoever happens to be standing nearest to you at any given moment, and then wondered why your sense of self feels so unstable, changing shape depending on who last held it. Jung believed that individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a fully realized person, requires you to reclaim authorship over your own psychological narrative. This does not mean becoming arrogant, immune to feedback, or dismissive of how you affect other people. It means developing an internal reference point stable enough that external opinions become information you can consider, rather than verdicts you must obey. Consider the difference between these two internal sentences. Someone thinks I am not good enough today, so I must not be good enough, versus someone thinks I am not good enough today, and I will consider whether that is useful information, separate from whether it changes who I actually am. The first sentence hands over the pen entirely. The second sentence keeps it in your hand while still remaining open to what the other person said. Building this kind of internal authorship is not accomplished through a single insight or a single affirmation repeated in a mirror. It is built the way any structure is built, slowly, through repeated small acts of self-referencing rather than other referencing. Every time you make a decision and check in with yourself first, before checking in with what everyone else will think, you are laying another brick in a foundation that eventually becomes sturdy enough to withstand real weather. Every time you notice a critical thought about yourself and pause to ask whether it is actually true or simply inherited from someone else's careless words years ago, you are doing the quiet, unglamorous work of taking the pen back. There is a particular exercise worth trying, not because it is mystical, but because it makes the abstract concrete. The next time a comment hurts you, write down exactly what was said, and then write down, honestly, whether you would have believed this same statement about yourself an hour before you heard it. Most of the time, you will discover that the belief was already present, waiting quietly beneath the surface, and the comment simply gave it a voice. This does not mean the other person is blameless for being careless with their words. It means the true work of healing does not happen by trying to control what people say to you, an impossible task, but by strengthening the internal structure that determines how much power their words are allowed to hold. The third layer, and the one Jung considered most essential, is shadow integration, and this is the layer almost no one wants to hear about, because it requires something far more uncomfortable than simply building confidence. It requires you to make peace with the exact parts of yourself that other people's comments are able to exploit in the first place. Think about the insults that actually land versus the ones that bounce off you completely. If someone accuses you of something wildly untrue, something you know with total certainty is false, it rarely wounds you at all. You might even laugh. But if someone accuses you of something you have secretly feared about yourself, something buried in what Jung called the shadow, the disowned, unexamined parts of your own psyche, the accusation lands like a blade, precisely because some part of you has never looked directly at that fear and decided, calmly, whether it is even true. This is the deepest reason certain people seem almost impossible to hurt, not because nothing bad is ever said to them, but because they have already done the difficult private work of examining their own weaknesses, insecurities, and darker impulses long before anyone else got the chance to weaponize them. A person who has honestly acknowledged their own selfishness cannot be devastated by being called selfish, because they have already metabolized that truth on their own terms, with compassion, rather than having it forced on them by someone trying to hurt them in the middle of an argument. Shadow integration means doing this work proactively, sitting with your own uncomfortable traits, your jealousy, your pettiness, your fear, your need for approval, and looking at them honestly rather than pretending they do not exist. Paradoxically, the parts of yourself you refuse to look at are the exact parts other people will eventually find and use against you, while the parts you have already faced lose almost all their power to wound. Consider two more scenarios, because the contrast makes this easier to feel rather than just understand intellectually. In the first, someone who has never examined their own insecurity about being unintelligent gets into an argument, and their opponent, sensing a weak point, calls them stupid. The word detonates something enormous inside them, disproportionate to the actual moment, because it has struck an old, unexamined wound that has been quietly aching for years, maybe since childhood, maybe since a specific humiliating classroom memory they have never fully processed. In the second scenario, someone who has already done the work of acknowledging, honestly and privately, that they are not the smartest person in every room and has made peace with that fact, hears the exact same insult and feels almost nothing. Not because they are secure in a fake, performed way, but because they have already had this conversation with themselves, on their own terms, long before anyone else tried to force it on them in anger. This is why shadow work, uncomfortable as it sounds, is not optional if you are serious about becoming genuinely resilient rather than simply performing toughness on the surface. A person who has not integrated their shadow can build all the confidence in the world on top of it, and it will still crack under the right kind of pressure because the foundation beneath the confidence was never actually solid. It was simply avoidance dressed up as strength. Real invulnerability, the kind Jung was actually describing across his life's work, is not the absence of weak points. It is the elimination of weak points as secrets, because a weakness you have already acknowledged to yourself cannot be used as a weapon against you in the same way a hidden one can. Put these 3 layers together and something remarkable begins to happen over time. Withdrawal of projection stops you from automatically treating every comment as an objective verdict on your worth. Internal authorship gives you a stable place to stand while you evaluate that comment on your own terms. And shadow integration removes the hidden nerves that used to make certain comments detonate disproportionately in the first place. None of this happens overnight, and none of it requires you to become cold, detached, or indifferent to the people around you. In fact, most people who do this work report feeling more connected to others afterward, not less, because they are no longer approaching every relationship from a place of quiet fear about what one wrong word might do to them. There is something important to clarify here, because this entire framework can be misunderstood if taken too far. Becoming impossible to hurt does not mean becoming impossible to affect. You will still feel things. You will still notice when someone is unkind, still register disappointment, still feel the natural sting of rejection or criticism in the moment it happens. The goal was never numbness. Numbness is simply a different kind of wound, one where the nervous system decides that shutting down entirely is safer than continuing to feel anything at all. What we are describing instead is something Jung would call psychological sovereignty, the capacity to feel a thing fully without that feeling determining your sense of self for hours, days, or years afterward. The hurt arrives, gets acknowledged, gets processed, and then passes through you rather than lodging permanently somewhere behind your ribs, waiting to be reactivated by the next careless comment that happens to brush against the same old wound. Think for a moment about a specific kind of person almost everyone has encountered, the one who seems to shrug off criticism that would flatten anyone else in the room. It is tempting to assume they simply care less, that something in them is missing, some capacity for feeling that the rest of us still carry. But watch them closely and you will usually see something different. They are not indifferent. They register the comment. Sometimes you can even see a flicker of reaction cross their face, but the reaction does not metastasize. It does not become an afternoon of rumination or a week of quiet self-doubt. It arrives, gets acknowledged, and passes, the way weather passes through a landscape without reshaping the ground beneath it. This is not a personality trait they were born with in most cases. It is very often the visible result of exactly the kind of internal work we have been describing, done quietly, over years, usually without anyone else ever noticing the effort behind it. It is worth noticing how differently people respond to you once this internal structure begins to solidify, even before you say a single word about it. People who once seemed to enjoy testing your reactions, dropping careless comments just to see how quickly you would spiral, gradually lose interest because the spiral simply stops happening. This is not because you have become unkind or distant toward them. It is because the particular reward they use to get from watching you unravel is no longer available. And most people, consciously or not, redirect their energy toward whoever still offers that reward. Meanwhile, the people who were never trying to destabilize you in the first place, the ones who genuinely cared how you were doing, tend to notice something different entirely, a new steadiness in how you carry yourself, one that makes you, ironically, easier to be close to rather than harder, because your steadiness gives them permission to be more honest with you, without fearing that honesty will wreck you. There is a reason Jung considered individuation the central task of a human life, rather than a single achievable milestone. This work of building internal armor is never technically finished. New situations will test the foundation you have built. Old wounds you thought were fully processed will occasionally surprise you by aching again under the right conditions. This is not evidence that you have failed or regressed. It is simply evidence that you are still human, still growing, still occasionally caught off guard by an old nerve you thought had gone quiet. The difference, once you have done this work seriously, is not that you will never feel hurt again. It is that hurt will no longer have the power to define you, to convince you of things about yourself that were never true to begin with, to make you smaller than you actually are simply because someone else, intentionally or carelessly, said something sharp in your direction. There is a final, quieter truth worth sitting with before we close. one that Jung returned to again and again throughout his life's work in different forms. The people who wound you most easily are rarely the people who dislike you the most. Often they are simply the people who happen to know, whether consciously or not, exactly where your unfinished business lives. This is not an accusation against them. It is simply an observation about how human beings, all of us, tend to instinctively find the softest ground in any relationship, especially under stress, especially in conflict, especially when we are frightened or defensive ourselves. The goal was never to punish people for finding that ground. The goal is to finish the business yourself, quietly, on your own terms, long before anyone else has the chance to stumble onto it accidentally and watch you fall apart over something you never chose to examine. So here is the question worth sitting with. The next time something small wounds you more than it should, before you spiral, before you replay it for the rest of the day, ask yourself honestly which of the 3 layers actually failed in that moment. Did you hand someone temporary authorship over your worth? Did you mistake their opinion for an objective verdict? Or did their comments simply find an old, unexamined wound you have never had the courage to look at directly? Whichever one it was, you now know exactly where the real work begins, and it was never about becoming harder. It was always about becoming whole. If this reached something true in you, leave a comment with the word unshaken, because that is exactly what we have been building toward this entire time. Not a person who feels nothing, but a person who can no longer be shattered by what other people carelessly throw. And if you want to keep building this kind of steadiness with someone who understands exactly what it takes, stay subscribed, because we are only getting started.